For 40 years, I meticulously calculated load-bearing walls, stress points, and seismic foundations, ensuring that the structures I engineered could withstand the most unforgiving of tempests. I believed that stability was a matter of mathematics, that if the foundation was sound and the materials were verified, nothing could possibly collapse. It is a bitter irony, then, that the most catastrophic structural failure of my life occurred within the very walls I called home, and that I was the one who inadvertently signed off on the flaws. People often speak of retirement as a well-earned repose, a golden afternoon following a lifetime of labor. They rarely mention the peculiar, slow erosion that occurs when you realize your greatest legacy, your own son, has become the primary threat to your peace. I am Howard Collins, 71 years old, a retired structural engineer living in the serene, leafy suburb of Toorak, Melbourne. We have resided in our Victorian-era home since 1995, a house of high ceilings and expansive corridors where the golden light of the afternoon always seems to linger in the living room. It was a home built for comfort, for memories, and for a future I thought I had secured through decades of disciplined saving and a spotless professional record. I spent my career ensuring the safety of Melbourne's commercial infrastructure, priding myself on an unblemished history of inspections and approvals. Yet, in the quiet hallways of my own residence, I failed to notice the creeping rot that would eventually bring the entire edifice of my family life to the ground. For the last 24 months, my existence has been redefined by a singular, suffocating presence: my son, Colin, and his wife, Brooke. When Colin approached us 2 years ago, claiming he needed a temporary residence in Toorak while his software startup navigated a rough fiscal quarter, I viewed it as an opportunity. I saw a chance to finally close the distance that my career-driven life had imposed between us. I had spent his childhood on job sites across Victoria, missing birthdays and milestones while I managed massive construction projects. That guilt had been a silent weight I carried for decades. I believed that by opening our home, by providing the capital for his business, and by offering them the master suite, I was finally discharging the debt of my past absences. I was mistaken. I had not opened my home to my son. I had invited a parasite to feast upon the very foundation I had labored to build. The disrespect did not arrive with a bang. It manifested in the daily, rhythmic erosion of our household standards. Brooke, a woman whose arrogance was matched only by her profound lack of work ethic, treated our Toorak home as a luxury hotel where the staff, my wife, Diane, was expected to provide perpetual service without acknowledgement. The granite countertops were perpetually cluttered with expensive takeout containers. The brand of coffee Diane meticulously sourced was dismissed as common, and the quiet, elegant rhythm of our mornings was shattered by the discordant noise of a life that viewed our existence as merely a backdrop for their ambition. I watched Diane, a woman of grace and profound resilience, begin to shrink within her own hallways. She learned to walk with a lighter step, to speak in lower tones, and to adjust her daily routines to avoid the suffocating scrutiny of her own daughter-in-law. I remained silent, trapped by my engineering mind's inability to reconcile the person I had raised with the man standing in my kitchen. I told myself it was a phase, that the startup's pressure was the cause, and that my guilt necessitated this tolerance. I was an engineer who understood how to stabilize a skyscraper, yet I was utterly incapable of stabilizing my own family. I stood in the center of the life I had spent 40 years constructing, watching the cracks widen in the drywall, completely unaware that I had already given the order for the demolition to begin. The deterioration of our sanctuary in Toorak was insidious, a slow process of social and physical displacement that I, in my naive desire for reconciliation, chose to interpret as the natural friction of multi-generational living. Colin was 34, an arrogant tech entrepreneur who possessed a profound capacity for selective memory. He frequently reminded me of his failed baseball games or missed school plays from 3 decades ago, weaponizing my past professional dedication as a moral debt I was obligated to repay. It was a sophisticated form of emotional extraction, Whenever I attempted to assert a boundary, suggesting that the master suite should remain a private domain, or that Diane should not be responsible for the cleaning of their personal quarters, Colin would look at me with a pained, performative disappointment. "I thought you were finally here for me, Dad," he would say, his voice thick with the calculated grief of an injured child. "I thought, after all these years, you would finally be the father who supports my dreams rather than the one who critiques my living situation." I swallowed my reservations, blinded by the very guilt I had carried since his youth. By the second year, the physical manifestation of this disrespect became impossible to ignore. Colin began parking his leased luxury sports car diagonally across the driveway, forcing me to leave my utility truck on the street, often exposed to the harsh Melbourne weather. It was a small, petty assertion of dominance, but it signaled a shift in the structural hierarchy of the home. Inside, the situation was far more invasive. Brooke began redecorating our living spaces, discarding heirlooms and family photographs, as though she were clearing out an abandoned property rather than the home of her parents-in-law. When Diane gently questioned the disappearance of a silver tea set that had belonged to her grandmother, Brooke merely laughed, dismissing the concern as the frailty of aging. "We are modernizing the aesthetic, Diane," she remarked, not bothering to look up from her phone. "The old sentimentality is just taking up valuable space." The daily burden fell most heavily upon Diane. I would return from my morning appointments to find her sitting in the small, sunless nook of the kitchen, having retreated there to avoid the chaos that now defined our common areas. She stopped hosting her reading group. She stopped inviting neighbors for afternoon tea. She even stopped pruning the rose bushes that had been her pride for 20 years. The vitality that had once defined her was being slowly drained, replaced by a quiet, watchful anxiety. I told myself that I was being patient, that I was exercising the same discipline I had applied to my most complex engineering projects. But in my heart, I knew the truth. I was not being patient. I was being cowardly. I was witnessing the structural integrity of my wife's spirit being compromised, and I was doing nothing to reinforce the foundation. I was an engineer who knew precisely when a load-bearing wall was about to buckle, yet I stood idly by, watching the cracks in our family life grow deep enough to swallow everything we had built. I had provided the physical shelter, but I had failed to protect the sanctuary within, and the cost of that failure was already mounting beyond repair. The breaking point did not arrive as a grand confrontation, but as a series of deceptively mundane requests that, in retrospect, were the final nails in our domestic coffin. It was a humid Wednesday in early December. Colin entered my study, an area I had desperately fought to keep as my private domain, carrying a thick, intimidating stack of legal documents. He looked disheveled, a deliberate aesthetic choice he used whenever he needed to portray himself as a man under siege by the cruelties of the corporate world. He informed me that his startup was facing a sudden, catastrophic tax liability with the Australian Taxation Office, ATO, due to a technical error in his payroll system. The urgency was palpable. He paced the narrow confines of the room, his voice rising and falling with the practiced cadence of a man describing an impending disaster. "Dad, if I do not clear this hurdle by Friday, they will freeze our operational accounts, and the entire venture will be liquidated," he claimed, his eyes wide and pleading. He explained that he needed me to sign a series of documents that he described as a temporary tax shelter. He told me it was a standard legal mechanism, a way to shield the family's assets from his business obligations while he secured a crucial bridging loan. "It is just paperwork, Dad. It is a formality to protect us from the ATO's reach. You have built this empire. I am just asking you to help me keep it standing for just a few months." My vision, often blurred by the exhaustion of trying to mediate the friction between Diane and Brooke, felt compromised. I looked at the papers. They were dense, jargon-filled, and utterly alien to my practical engineering mind. There were yellow sticky notes attached to every signature block, strategically placed to ensure I did not linger on the text. I hesitated, a brief flicker of my professional skepticism surfacing. The voice that had spent 4 decades questioning the load-bearing capacity of every steel beam I had ever inspected. But then, Colin played his masterstroke. He slumped against my desk, put his head in his hands, and whispered, "I just want you to have my back for once. You were never there when I was growing up because you were building things for strangers. Can't you build something with me for once?" The guilt, that ancient, crushing weight, suffocated my better judgment. I did not call my solicitor. I did not consult Diane, who was at that very moment trying to navigate a passive-aggressive lecture from Brooke in the garden. I reached for the pen. I signed exactly where the yellow notes indicated, believing I was performing an act of paternal grace. Colin took the documents, his demeanor shifting instantly from desperate to composed. He did not thank me with the warmth of a son. He thanked me with the clinical efficiency of a junior partner closing a deal. I did not realize then that I had not signed a tax shelter. I had signed a formal transfer of land, irrevocably handing the legal title of our two-rack home into a trust controlled entirely by him and Brooke. I had, with my own steady hand, engineered the structural collapse of my own life. The aftermath of my misplaced trust remained dormant for exactly 6 months, a quiet period that allowed the deception to solidify like concrete in a mold. I felt a false sense of security, believing that I had fulfilled my paternal duty and saved Colin from the brink of professional ruin. On a Tuesday afternoon, I arrived at the Alfred Hospital in Melbourne for my routine cardiology consultation. The appointment was a stark reminder of my mortality. The cardiologist noted a mild arrhythmia, urging me to reduce my stress levels and prioritize tranquility in my 71st year. I left the clinic with a mild sense of resolve, intent on returning to our two-rack residence to convince Diane that it was time we took that long-deferred coastal holiday to Mornington Peninsula. I wanted to escape the suffocating atmosphere of our home and reclaim a fragment of the life we had shared before the intrusion. The 45-minute drive back to two-rack was filled with a quiet, reflective stillness that felt uncharacteristically heavy. As I turned onto our street, the familiar silhouette of our Victorian home came into view, but the atmosphere was discordant. Diane was standing by our wrought iron gate, her posture fragile and trembling. She was holding a single leather overnight bag, her face pale, with tears tracking silently through the fine lines around her eyes. The sight of her, vulnerable, displaced, and utterly bewildered, hit me with the physical force of a seismic shift. I pulled my utility truck to the curb and hurried toward her, my heart drumming a frantic, irregular rhythm against my ribs. Before I could reach her, the front door of our home swung open. Colin emerged onto the porch, flanked by Brooke, who stood behind him with her arms crossed, her expression one of cold, clinical amusement. Colin did not carry the desperation of a man struggling to survive. He stood with the arrogant poise of an owner. He held a thick manila folder in his hand, tapping it rhythmically against his thigh. When he saw me, he did not offer a greeting. He simply nodded toward the gate, his voice loud enough to carry across the quiet, manicured street. "You are trespassing, Howard," he declared, the title dad stripped away as if it were a redundant garment. "The property is officially registered to Apex Summit Holdings. You and your wife have 30 minutes to vacate the premises before I call the Victoria Police to have you removed." I felt the blood drain from my extremities, leaving me cold in the afternoon sun. I looked at Diane, who could barely articulate the words, her voice shattering as she described how they had forced her out of the house, mocking her as she packed a single bag of essentials. I turned back to my son, the man I had provided for, the man I had forgiven for a lifetime of absences and failures. The rage that surged within me was not the hot, frantic anger of a desperate man. It was the chilling, absolute clarity of an engineer witnessing the final, catastrophic failure of a structure he had foolishly trusted. I realized then that Colin had not just evicted us. He had methodically planned this moment for half a year, waiting for the legal documents I had signed to take full effect. I did not drop to my knees, and I did not beg for an explanation. I simply stepped to the gate, retrieved Diane's bag, and took her hand. I knew then that the only way to survive this collapse was to abandon the ruins entirely and begin the cold, precise work of demolition. We walked away from the wrought iron gate of our home in Turek, the heavy click of the latch sounding like the final bell of a long, exhausting fight. I did not look back. An engineer does not stare at the wreckage once the collapse has been confirmed. I guided Diane toward my truck, her hand cold and limp in mine, her silence a devastating testament to the violation we had just endured. We drove away from the leafy, serene streets of our neighborhood, navigating the familiar avenues of Melbourne with a hollow, mechanical focus. I did not head toward the city center or toward the homes of friends who might offer a temporary bed. I knew that in this new landscape, privacy and anonymity were the only assets I could afford to retain. I bypassed the main highways and directed the truck toward the industrial outskirts near the port, finding a heavily fortified, functional extended stay establishment in Docklands. It was a place where privacy was the primary commodity, shielded from the scrutiny of the wealthy suburbs by a labyrinth of modern apartment blocks and bustling transport hubs. I rented a corner unit for 2 months, paying the entirety of the lease in crisp, untraceable cash, a habit I had developed decades ago as a safeguard against sudden economic downturns. The room was small, sterile, and entirely devoid of the history that now felt like a noose around our necks. As I pulled the heavy blackout curtains across the window, sealing us away from the city lights, the reality of our displacement finally settled into the room. Diane sat on the edge of the stiff, utilitarian bed, her eyes fixed on the blank wall. The woman who had filled our 2-rack home with the scent of lilies and the music of her reading groups was gone, replaced by a shell of profound, maternal grief. I did not offer empty platitudes about reconciliation or the hope that our son might return to his senses. I knelt before her, holding her hands firmly to ground her in the present. I told her that the house we had left behind was no longer a home. It was a structural hazard, a compromised site that required total evacuation. I informed her that from this moment forward, I was the only person responsible for our survival, and that we were transitioning from a state of victimhood into a state of tactical defense. I unpacked our 3 suitcases, the only remnants of 40 years of life, and laid out the blueprints I had salvaged from the back of my study closet. I had not been defeated. I had merely completed a necessary site clearance. As I began to organize my notes on the laminate tabletop, I felt the cold, hard resolve of an engineer who had finally stopped grieving over a failed project and started analyzing the stress fractures. I knew Colin's arrogance would be his undoing. He believed he had outmaneuvered an elderly man who did not understand the modern world. He failed to realize that he had inadvertently declared war on a man who understood exactly how to identify a foundation's weakest point. That night, under the sterile glow of the Docklands Motel, I began the meticulous, calculated process of dismantling the empire he thought he had stolen. The demolition had begun, and for the first time in years, my mind was entirely clear. The morning following our retreat to Docklands, I left Diane resting in the quiet, climate-controlled silence of the motel and drove into the heart of Melbourne's financial district. I did not head toward a neighborhood solicitor who dealt in wills or minor property disputes. I drove straight to Collins Street, the epicenter of corporate power and unforgiving litigation. My destination was the office of Gavin Pierce, a forensic litigator whose reputation was forged in the fires of massive commercial structural failures and high-stakes corporate disputes. We had crossed paths 20 years ago during the construction of a landmark skyscraper on the South Bank, where he had systematically dismantled a corrupt contractor who had attempted to bypass safety regulations using substandard steel. Gavin was a man who operated with the cold, unyielding precision of a scalpel, entirely devoid of sentimentality and singularly focused on the complete annihilation of his opponent's position. As I was ushered into his office, which overlooked the sweeping gray expanse of the city skyline, the contrast to my previous life was jarring. Gavin did not offer a cup of tea or a sympathetic inquiry regarding the state of my family. He simply gestured toward the high-backed leather chair opposite his marble desk. He had aged with sharp, predatory lines etched around his eyes and silver at his temples. but the intelligence in his gaze remained as sharp as the day we first met. I placed the manila folder containing the municipal property records and the signed transfer of land documents squarely in the center of his desk. I did not allow my voice to falter. I laid out the facts with the detached, clinical efficiency of a structural analysis. I described the forged tax shelter, the exploitation of my parental guilt, and the final, brutal eviction from the Turak residence. Gavin listened without interrupting, his pen resting poised over a legal pad, tracking the progression of the fraud. When I finished, he did not offer pity. Instead, he leaned back, steepling his fingers, and remarked that what I had presented was a flawlessly executed piece of corporate predatory behavior. "Howard," he began, his voice calm and resonant, "you have not been swindled by a disorganized amateur. Your son has not only structured this to appear as a legitimate legal transfer, but he has woven a medical clause into the document, citing your advanced age and a fictitious decline in your cognitive faculty to justify his power of attorney. He has not merely stolen your house. He has legally erased your autonomy." I felt the weight of his assessment, yet I did not flinch. I had expected nothing less from Colin's calculated arrogance. I leaned forward, resting my palms on the cool marble, and asked the only question that mattered: how we could bypass the slow, grinding machinery of the civil courts and strike directly at the foundation of the corporation he had used to hide his theft. Gavin's expression remained unreadable, but I saw a faint, dangerous flicker of interest in his dark eyes. He understood that I was not asking for a restoration of the status quo. I was asking for the authorization to initiate a controlled demolition. I had come to Gavin Pierce not to negotiate, but to deploy the only weapon that an engineer can wield with absolute certainty: the truth applied with enough pressure to force the entire structure to collapse under its own weight. We were no longer fighting a family dispute. We were entering a corporate war, and for the first time, I felt the satisfying cold certainty that I was finally in control of the project. Gavin Pierce did not stop his pursuit of the truth with a simple examination of the property transfer records. He reached into his briefcase and produced a second, significantly heavier manila folder, his expression now sharpened by the professional adrenaline of a forensic litigator identifying a systemic breach. He explained that forensic accounting is akin to pulling a loose thread on a poorly tailored suit. Once the tension is applied, the entire garment unravels to reveal the compromised stitching underneath. He had run a deep background trace on the limited liability company listed on the fraudulent title, Apex Summit Holdings. To any casual observer, the name suggested an aggressive, modern tech startup. However, as Gavin spread a series of complex corporate flowcharts across the marble desk, the reality was revealed as something far more parasitic. The flowcharts showed that my son, the supposed visionary entrepreneur who had bragged about exclusive venture capital meetings, held a mere 10% equity stake in the holding company. Brooke held another 10%. My stomach tightened as Gavin placed a high-resolution photograph in the center of the desk, a picture of Gordon Sullivan, the billionaire commercial developer known for his ruthless acquisition of distressed residential properties. Gordon held the remaining 80% controlling interest in my Turak home. Colin had not merely stolen my house to satisfy his ego. He had traded the deed to his father-in-law to settle a massive, secret debt. Gavin explained that Colin's software startup was a complete fabrication, a hollow vessel he had used to burn through my retirement savings before turning to Gordon for private capital. Gavin's forensic analysis revealed that Gordon Sullivan had intentionally absorbed my property as collateral for a $70 million construction loan he was currently negotiating for a massive project in South Bank. Because I had diligently paid off my mortgage a decade ago, my home represented pure, unencumbered equity, the precise asset Gordon required to finalize his over-leveraged deal. The staggering scale of the conspiracy settled over the room like a suffocating fog. My son had not just evicted his elderly parents to secure a luxury residence. He had willingly sacrificed us on the altar of his own professional failure, throwing his mother and father to a corporate shark simply to avoid bankruptcy. I stared at the flowcharts, tracing the lines of betrayal from my home in Turak to the boardroom of a billionaire developer. I did not feel the erratic pulse of panic. I felt the cold, hard clarity of a man who has finally identified the structural defect that will cause a collapse. I looked at Gavin and asked him how he could transform this house from a strategic asset into a catastrophic liability for both the billionaire and my son. A slow, dangerous smile spread across his face as he picked up his pen. The war was no longer about a piece of suburban real estate. It was about exposing the corruption that held their entire empire together, and I was now the one holding the demolition blueprints. The following morning, after a restless night, under the sterile ceiling of the Docklands Motel, I realized that I possessed the one advantage Colin and Gordon had underestimated. They viewed me as an obsolete relic of a bygone era, a man whose utility ended when his signature was secured. They could not conceive that I would return to the Turak property to retrieve the raw materials of their undoing. I knew the house better than any security system they could install. I knew the floor joists, the wiring conduits, and the hidden maintenance access points I had personally designed during the home's renovation. Colin, in his boundless arrogance, had converted the climate-controlled basement into a server room for his fraudulent startup, assuming that a retired engineer would never grasp the importance of his digital infrastructure. He had left the physical console unlocked, relying on the naive belief that his remote firewalls were an impenetrable fortress. I arrived at the Turak residence at 3 a.m., navigating the familiar, manicured streets under a thick blanket of Melbourne fog. I did not approach the front gate or the electronic garage entrance, knowing full well these were monitored by smart home systems designed to alert Colin to my presence. Instead, I approached through the utility mudroom, utilizing the mechanical override I had installed years ago for emergency maintenance. Every muscle in my body was coiled with a precise, clinical tension as I turned the brass knob, the mechanism yielding with a soft, familiar click. I moved through the darkness like a ghost in my own home, my footsteps deliberate and soundless against the hardwood. I did not visit the kitchen where Diane had once gathered her friends, nor did I stop to look at the master suite where my son was currently sleeping, confident in his stolen victory. I went straight to the basement. The room was cool and vibrated with the low, constant hum of the server cooling fans, a mechanical pulse that sounded, to my ears, like the heart of a failing organism. I moved to the central server rack, a chaotic tangle of wires that reflected Colin's fundamental lack of discipline. He had focused entirely on software defense, neglecting the physical vulnerability of his hardware. I connected my portable laptop to the primary administrative port, using the specialized bridging cables I had acquired from a commercial supply store. The screen flickered, a dull green light illuminating the concrete walls, and within seconds, I had bypassed his biometric locks. It was a humiliatingly simple breach. I initiated a sector-by-sector clone of the entire directory, watching the progress bar climb with the cold anticipation of a predator. For 45 agonizing minutes, I stood in the absolute dark, listening to the house settle. Once, the silence was shattered by the distinct, rhythmic creak of a floorboard directly above my head. The specific board I knew because I had driven the nails into it myself. I held my breath, frozen in the shadows as Colin's footsteps moved across the master bedroom, followed by the faint groan of the copper pipes in the walls. He was merely getting a glass of water, utterly oblivious that I was currently downloading the raw, unedited financial proof of his corporate fraud from the very room he occupied. When the progress bar finally hit 100%, I disconnected the cables, wiped the dust from the chassis where my hand had rested, and retreated through the mudroom. As I drove back toward the city, the encrypted solid-state drive tucked securely in my bag, I felt the finality of the act. I had harvested the foundation of their empire, and by sunrise, I would begin the process of triggering the collapse. Back in the quiet, industrial sanctuary of our Docklands Motel, I finally confronted the bedrock of my son's deception. Diane remained asleep, the weight of the last few days finally yielding to the exhaustion that only profound betrayal can inflict. I sat at the laminate table, the glow of my laptop casting a sharp, clinical light across the room as I decrypted the 2 terabytes of data I had harvested from the basement in Turak. I approached this task not as a vengeful father, but as a forensic investigator conducting a post-collapse analysis. I skipped over the superficial layers, the glossy marketing presentations, the empty profit projections, and the hollow corporate mission statements, and dug directly into the archive communication logs and institutional wire transfer receipts. What I uncovered was far more damning than a mere real estate theft. My son had not been pitching his technology to venture capitalists. He had been systematically targeting massive federal innovation grants managed by government bodies, specifically pitching his firm as a revolutionary engineering consultancy. He had solicited nearly $900,000 in taxpayer-funded innovation grants, claiming to possess advanced algorithms for commercial infrastructure stability. As I scrolled through the documentation, my breath hitched in my throat. On page 42 of the formal federal application, I found the evidence of the ultimate transgression, a high-resolution scan of my own official state engineering seal, followed by a flawless digital forgery of my signature. He had used my name, my honor, and the reputation I had spent 40 years meticulously building to finance his lavish lifestyle and his secret debts to Gordon Sullivan. The realization hit me with the force of a structural collapse. He had not merely defrauded the public. He had positioned me as the primary technical guarantor of a fraudulent enterprise. Had his software, which I now knew was non-existent, ever been implemented or audited by a federal inspector, I would have been the one to face the consequences. I would have been stripped of my license, my pension would have been seized, and I would have spent my final years in a federal penitentiary for a felony I had no knowledge of committing. He had effectively used my professional identity as a human shield to protect his own cowardice. I sat back in the cheap motel chair, the silence of the room suddenly amplified by the magnitude of what I held. The sorrow I had felt regarding the loss of my son evaporated, replaced by a cold, surgical clarity. He had left me no path to reconciliation because he had never viewed me as a father. He had viewed me as an asset to be liquidated. I began typing the final commands to compile this evidence into a master file for Gavin Pierce. I no longer needed to pursue a slow, expensive civil case by forging my engineering credentials to defraud the federal government. Colin had transformed his domestic betrayal into a severe federal felony. The trap was now fully primed. I looked at the forged signature one last time, the exact weight of the pen stroke, the familiar flourish, and realized that my son had unknowingly handed me the definitive weapon required to bury his empire. The demolition was no longer a possibility. It was an inevitability. The days that followed in our Docklands retreat were marked by a silence so profound it felt as though the entire city had ceased its pulse. I kept my mobile device powered down, a necessary tactical decision to ensure complete invisibility. I was no longer the reliable father who would rush to address his son's crises. I had become a phantom, existing entirely outside the reach of his frantic machinations. On the third day, I allowed myself 5 minutes of connectivity. My screen ignited with a relentless cascade of notifications. 32 missed calls from Colin and 14 increasingly desperate messages from Brooke. They were caught in the exact psychological trap I had meticulously prepared. By refusing to engage, by depriving them of the emotional feedback they required to sustain their narrative of victimhood, I forced them to exist solely within their own mounting paranoia. They were trapped in the Turak residence, surrounded by the physical evidence of their theft, but completely blind to the fact that the digital foundation of their empire was already dissolving. I watched the voicemails populate the screen. Initially, they were arrogant, demanding to know where I had sequestered Diane, dripping with the entitlement of people who believe they held the absolute upper hand. As the days progressed, the tone shifted into a jagged, brittle desperation. Colin began to plead, his voice cracking as he begged for a negotiation, for a chance to resolve this like adults. I deleted every single recording without listening to the end. There was nothing left to resolve. The time for mediation had passed the moment he decided to forge my professional identity to secure a federal grant. Brooke's texts were far more venomous. She mocked my silence, labeling my disappearance as the cowardly retreat of a broken old man and threatening to contact the Victoria police to report me for trespassing should I ever set foot on the Turak driveway again. I read her vicious words with a detached, clinical interest, observing the way her arrogance blinded her to the legal precipice upon which she was standing. She genuinely believed that because she had secured the deed and the police escort, she had achieved a total victory. She did not know that the keys she guarded so jealously were merely decorative trinkets in a house that was now effectively a crime scene. I removed the SIM card from my phone, placed the pieces of plastic and lithium on the motel table, and officially plunged into the darkness. I had severed the final communication lines. Colin and Brooke were now locked inside a stolen home, completely unaware that Gavin Pierce and I were currently wiring the federal evidence directly to the authorities. The storm was not coming. It was already inside the walls, waiting in the silence. The evening of the housewarming party in Turak was the final, perfectly orchestrated movement of our strategy. Gavin Pierce and I arrived in the back of a black corporate car, blending seamlessly into the fleet of luxury vehicles that choked the quiet suburban street. The house, which I had poured my life's labor into, was now a beacon of unearned arrogance, illuminated by aggressive landscaping lights and teeming with an elite crowd of corporate investors, venture capitalists, and municipal politicians. We bypassed the valet, walked straight through the propped-open front door, and entered the foyer. The atmosphere was a thick, suffocating blend of expensive champagne and manufactured success. I watched my son near the bay windows I had personally installed, wearing a velvet tuxedo and holding court with the practiced ease of a man who believed he had successfully stolen his future. Brooke circulated through the room, loudly mocking the obsolete tastes of the previous owners to her wealthy acquaintances, entirely unaware that her father-in-law was standing 10 feet away, witnessing the desecration of his legacy. We moved through the crowd with the deliberate pace of a structural assessment. The guests, initially oblivious, began to instinctively part ways, sensing a foreign gravity in our presence. The loud, pulsing music seemed to fade as the human noise in the room evaporated into a heavy, unnatural silence. Brooke was the first to recognize me. Her triumphant smile shattered into a mask of unfiltered rage as she marched toward us, demanding to know how I had bypassed security. Before she could launch her tirade, Gavin Pierce stepped smoothly into her path. He did not touch her, but his presence was a physical barrier of pure legal authority. He spoke in a voice quiet enough to be intimate, yet sharp enough to cut through the room. "I suggest you remain silent, Mrs. Collins. Anything you say in the presence of these witnesses will be formally entered into the federal record as evidence of your criminal complicity." She froze, the color draining from her face as the implication of his words shattered her social composure. I did not stop walking. I maintained my trajectory toward the formal dining room, where Gordon Sullivan, the billionaire developer behind the Apex Summit Holdings conspiracy, was holding a presentation for a group of international bankers. He was bragging about the unencumbered equity of the Turak property, using it as the final piece of collateral for his $70 million commercial construction loan. He looked up, his booming laugh dying in his throat as he saw Gavin and me standing in his doorway. I did not look at Colin, who remained cowering in the hallway, his face a portrait of ruin. I focused entirely on Gordon, who stood at the head of my mahogany table, a man who thought he could leverage a family's destruction to secure his own empire. Gavin Pierce walked to the center of the table, placed a thick stack of federal indictments next to the billionaire's crystal glass, and began to detail the systematic fraud. The look of profound, dawning terror on Gordon's face was the most precise, structural truth I had ever witnessed. The entire foundation of their stolen world was finally and irrevocably giving way. The collapse of the Turak Empire was not a singular event. It was a chain reaction, precise and inevitable. As Gavin Pierce announced the formal notice of lease penned-ins and detailed the federal wire fraud charges, the dining room devolved into a landscape of panicked retreat. The international bankers, recognizing the radioactive nature of the forged documents, vanished into the night with the cold efficiency of predators abandoning a sinking ship. Gordon Sullivan, the billionaire who had built his reputation on ruthless acquisition, stood amidst the wreckage of his own calculations, his face drained of color as the notifications of loan defaults cascaded across his phone screen. My son, Colin, was left shivering on the polished hardwood of the hallway, stripped of his fraudulent genius and exposed as a pathetic federal criminal before the very elite he had desperately sought to impress. Brooke, demonstrating the ruthless survivalism she had learned from her father, threw her engagement ring onto the floor and walked out into the winter air, initiating divorce proceedings before the night had even concluded. 2 days later, the legal reclamation of the Toorak residence was finalized. Gavin Pierce had executed the dissolution of Apex Summit Holdings with the same surgical precision he applied to every commercial failure he encountered. I drove my utility truck up the driveway under a clear, sharp winter sky, the silence of the neighborhood returning to its accustomed peace. There were no sports cars, no pulsating music, and no ghosts of the parasites who had tried to occupy my life. I stepped through the front door, no longer a victim, but an engineer reclaiming his territory. The first order of business was the total eradication of their presence. A private security firm arrived to strip away the compromised smart home system, replacing it with local, encrypted protocols that could never be accessed remotely. I watched as they removed every digital tether Colin had used to monitor my home, effectively purging the structure of his toxic influence. That evening, Diane and I sat on the back porch, the air crisp and fragrant with the scent of the garden she was already planning to restore. We did not speak of the man who had occupied the master suite, nor did we mourn the loss of the treacherous son who had traded his own family for a hollow ambition. They were merely debris, successfully cleared from the site. I realized then that my 40 years as a structural engineer had provided me with more than just the ability to calculate loads and stresses. It had given me the understanding that nothing truly durable can be built upon a foundation of deceit. True family is not merely a product of shared blood, but a construct of shared integrity and unwavering loyalty. I had lost the son I thought I had raised, but I had reclaimed my home, my wife's peace, and a dignity that no amount of corporate fraud could ever dismantle. The foundation was secure again, and as I watched the sunset cast its long, steady light across our Toorak home, I knew that this structure, fortified by the truth, would finally stand the test of time.